Welcome to Virtual Wisdom Finance and Accounting Tutorials. My name is Peter and I'll be your host in this particular tutorial. Today, I want us to look at a topic in quantitative methods or quantitative techniques. And our topic today is conditional probability. So we are going to look at what conditional probability is. We are going to define it, and we are going to look at scenarios that necessitate calculation of conditional probability. We are also going to look at an illustration on the same. So let's start by defining conditional probability. So conditional probability is the probability that is associated with combinations of events, but given that some prior results has already been achieved with one of them. So as you can see from this statement here, there is an already achieved event before the occurrence of the next. So in most of the times, conditional probability is applicable in scenario where the events are dependent. So we talk of dependent events. So what are dependent events? So dependent events are those events where the occurrence or non-occurrence of one affects the occurrence or non-occurrence of the other. That is, the events have a conditional relationship. If we have two events, for example, we have event A and we have another event B. If event B cannot happen, if A have not happened, then we say B is dependent on event A, and thus the dependent relationship between these two events. Maybe we can look at an example of dependent events. One example: passing of exam is dictated by a number of events like what? Teaching, reading, and revising. So what we mean by that? For you to pass an exam, you must be taught, you must read, and you must revise. So that is saying that passing of exams is dependent on being taught, on reading, and revising. Another example: for you to get hired for a job, there are some activities that precede it, that activities that come before. And these activities or events include: one, for you to get hired for a job, you must make an application for that job. Number two, you must be called for an interview. So after the application, an interview comes in, and later you get hired for the job. So that means getting hired is dependent on application and interview on that particular job. So that tells you that one event cannot happen if the preceding event has not happened. And that is what brings about the concept of conditional probability. There is a condition for the event to be fulfilled. Having mentioned that, I'll go straight to looking at the formula that you can apply to get the conditional probability. So conditional probability is expressed in this format, that this which represents the probability of X given that Y has occurred. And for you to get conditional probability, we normally use this formula here. So the probability of X given that Y has occurred is given by the probability of X and Y divided by the probability of Y. Using the previous examples that I've just given, let X be passing exams. then Y, B, all other events preceding the passing of exams. And these activities including what? Reading, being taught, and revising. So what we are saying here is that the probability of passing exams, given that you have been taught and you have revised, that's how you get it. I'm just trying to replace our X and Y in that particular illustration. Same way, the probability of getting hired for a job, given that you have been called for the interview and you made application. That is where the condition comes in. And to calculate that, to get the probability of X and Y, we have to apply the rule of multiplication, or what we call the multiplication rule in probability. And what this rule states is that if we have two events, A and B, then by multiplication rule, the probability of A and B, or what we are simply placing as a probability of AB, it is given by the probability of A multiplied by the probability of B. Therefore, in our case, the probability of X, Y will be given by the probability of X multiplied by the probability of Y. Having gotten that, you divide it with the probability of Y and you have the conditional probability. That is the probability of X given Y. Having looked at that, let's look at an illustration and see. Maybe this might be even simpler when we look at an illustration on conditional probability. So you're given a question here that in a competitive examination, 30 candidates are to be selected in all 600 candidates who appear in a written test, and 100 will be called for the interview. If you read it clearly, you find that there is a condition. You are told that in this examination, it is 30 candidates that are going to be selected. But all the candidates in total, there are 600. But out of the 600, it's only 100 that will be called for the interview. So you have to understand the question for you to be able to respond to what you're required to do. So required. 1, what is the probability that a person will be called for the interview? 2, what is the probability that a person is called for the interview and is selected? 3, determine the probability of a person getting selected if he has been called for the interview. So I want us to understand the question first. Where does it start? First of all, there are 600 candidates. But out of these 600, only 100 will be called for the interview. That means selection occurs after the interview. There is a condition there that for you to be selected, you must be called for the interview. That's the first thing you need to understand. Now, let's try solving this question. Let's start with the first one. What is the probability that a person will be called for the interview? So we are told that we have 600 candidates, and out of the 600, 100 of them will be called for the interview. So let's see be that the person is called for the interview. So the probability of being called, which I'm representing as PC, will be given by what? For you to be called for the interview, to get this probability, it will be the total, the number of persons who will be called out of the total population. So 100 would be called for the interview out of the total 600, and therefore the probability of being called for the interview is a sixth. The second one, probability that a person is called for the interview and is selected. You need to understand the question. You called and you are selected. So let S be the probability that a person is selected. So the probability of getting selected, which is PS, would be given by what? So like we have said, 100 people will be called for the interview. And this is 100 out of 600 who are willing to be called or who have actually made application. But now, after being called for the interview, that is when you proceed to getting selected. So how many people are we selecting? We are selecting 30 people out of those that were called for the interview. So that will be the probability of getting selected will be given by 30 out of 100, where 30 is the number that we are looking for, or the number of persons to select out of the persons who will be available. So we are choosing, or we are selecting from a population of 100, and we are choosing 30. And therefore, the probability of getting selected is 30 out of 100, which is 3 out of 10. Now, the question here is asking, what is the probability that person is called for the interview and is selected? And from that, based on the rule of multiplication, like we did here, that the probability of A and B is given as probability of A multiplied by probability of B. Back to our question. Therefore, the probability of being called and selected will be given by what? It is the same as the probability of C and S, which is the probability of being called multiplied by the probability of getting selected. And we have gotten that the probability of being called is a sixth. The probability of being selected is 3 out of 10. So when you multiply the two, that is applying the rule of multiplication in probability, you get 1 over 20 as the probability of getting called and selected. We proceed to part 3 of this question. So part 3 is asking, determine the probability of a person getting selected if he has been called for the interview. So I wanted to read that question again and understand the concept. They are saying, determine the probability of a person getting selected if he has been called for the interview. So if you look at that, there is a condition that what is the probability of you getting selected given that you have been called for the interview. And therefore, here you have to apply conditional probability, because getting selected is dependent on being called for an interview. So therefore, the probability of getting selected given that you are called for the interview will be given by what? The probability of getting selected given that you are called will be given by the probability of getting called and selected divided by the probability of being called. And like we have seen, the probability of being called and selected, the probability of being called and selected, like we have calculated here, is 1 over 20. Then we are dividing that by the probability of being called, which is 1 over 6. That's giving us 3 over 10 as the probability of a person getting selected given that they were actually called for the interview. And that is the whole concept in conditional probability. This was a virtual wisdom, finance and accounting tutorials. If you like the content that I have shared, kindly do me some favor and click on subscribe to this channel. Also, don't forget to click on the bell besides the subscription button so that you can be notified anytime that I upload new videos, so that we can keep on learning together, keep on understanding and studying finance and accounting with ease. It is also important, if you really love what I'm doing, you can also give me a like. Yeah, like this particular work, share with your friends. Also feel free to leave a comment. I'm going to check and I'm going to respond to your comments as and when you post them. I was your host, Peter, and I'm so grateful for your time, and I'm hoping that you have not forgotten to subscribe. Kindly subscribe to this channel as a way of appreciating and as a way of promoting the good work that I'm doing. Thank you once more, and I'm hoping to see you in my coming tutorials. I'll be making more tutorials on quantitative methods, on finance and accounting. Let's meet in my next tutorial. Thank you once more. Bye.